All right.
I'd like sure to mention we're looking for Angular developers, but also Android and iOS. Okay. So
We're broadcasting. Like now.
Right now?
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Hi, YouTube.
All right. Do you want to control this?
Cool. All right, everybody, welcome to Rocky Mountain Angular, sponsored by BrieBug. My name is Anthony. I'm one of the dev team leads here. BrieBug, we do architectural reviews, training, as well as consulting and staff augmentation. We've got some social media links here. You can find us everywhere. The code of conduct, Brian mentioned this a couple weeks ago or a couple meetups ago. Basically, don't be a jerk. But if you do have any violations to report, there's some instructions here, a few different ways you can report that. Upcoming meetups. So on November 8th, we have one in the Tech Center at Quinix. So James Spivey and Joe Estrella, they will be presenting. Their topics are TBD. The following meetup is December 5th at Battery 621, so downtown. And that is our holiday hangout, and we'll have 3 lightning talks. And that's actually the rest of the meetups for the year. Speaking of the lightning talks, we have a call for presenters. So we do need presenters. If you have something you can talk for 10 to 20 minutes on, let us know. So you can email meetups@BrieBug. Is anyone looking for work? You want to stand up and introduce yourself, Jason?
Sure. Hi, Jason. 20 years doing web design and just graduated from General Assembly's immersive program, so trying to pivot into a more technical front-end developer role. So exploring all of the frameworks and first job, if anybody who needs a junior dev, a lot of design experience, UI, UX, like that.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. All right. Is anyone looking for developers? So we are at BrieBug. We are hiring Angular developers as well as we're looking for Android and iOS as well. So if you have any experience or know anyone, let us know. Some housekeeping. So basically, bathrooms are down the hall, around the corner. Obviously, there's drinks in the fridge, pizza on the counter. We are doing YouTube live, so we're streaming. So if you do get up during the presentation, just try to avoid the camera. So, and then announcements. Angular updates for October. So Angular 7 was just released. It supports TypeScript 3.1, as well as the new version 1 Shadow DOM, which is a new version of Shadow DOM that's supported by many different browsers, not just Chrome and Opera this time. There are some updates to the can load interface, a new ng-do bootstrap method in your app component. Ivy is not released, but it is there just behind a flag, so you can play around with that if you want. And then the Angular CLI has prompts now. So for things like changing which CSS preprocessor you want to use, you can go through a prompt for that rather than using flag. Angular Material 7 was also released with Angular 7. So that now aligns with the 2018 material spec. So Google's material, they have standards that Angular Material is now aligned with. There's also a new drag and drop functionality in the CDK, as well as virtual scrolling. There's a new component for bottom sheet, which is pretty cool. check that out. And then new and improved schematics. So exciting news for January. We're doing an evening of Angular, except it's more like a day of Angular. And we're going to have 4 different presenters. So that'll be mid-January. Did you say 17th or 18th?
16th
Or 16th or 17th, so right in the middle of the month.
And it'll be the end of the day. It won't be a full day. It's like a half day.
Yeah. And then we're going to have 4 presenters, and then the venue is also TBD.
It'll be cool though.
Cool. As I mentioned before, we are live streaming on YouTube. So everybody say hi, YouTube.
Hi, YouTube.
And we do have some swag. So if you want a t-shirt or a bottle, just come up and ask questions. Did you have anything else? No? Okay. Cool. All right, so our first presenter is our marketing manager here at BrieBug. So she actually organizes the meetups, and she's giving a presentation on giving presentations at meetups. So give it up for Jessica.
Hi guys. So this is my first presentation, but I do get to see a lot of them. And I talk to a lot of people who don't want to present for various reasons, and mostly they're dumb. So we're going to go into why you should present and why your excuses aren't really reasonable excuses. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the more actively involved members, or the more actively involved the meetup members are, the more value they bring to the community, like as a whole. That's, volunteering to present. That is suggesting topics. We want, this is for the community, right? And it's just more valuable for everyone if there are more people presenting, because different people have different ideas and everyone's working on unique projects, and it's good to share those with everyone, right? So what we've seen a lot over the past, so I've been here and helping organize Rocky Mountain Angular meetup for about a year, and there's often the same people want to present over and over and over again, which they're really great presenters, they're really good topics, but we want more variety, in levels of topics, and we need some more beginner stuff and whatever. And it's kind of so I was thinking it's kind of like pizza. I love pizza. It's great, right? I love it. I like it with different toppings. If I was eating it 2 days in a row, I'd still be pretty stoked because it's really good. After the 3rd day, I might get a little sick of it, even though it's great pizza. And it's just, this is sort of what's happening, is we're having the same thing. It's different topics, but the same people a lot. And I feel like that doesn't, or we feel like that's not bringing the best value to the whole community. So first things first, people who don't want to present, you can do this. I've never presented before. I actually came up with this idea yesterday. I was like, hey, I'll do the lightning talk. I'll talk about presenting. And then here I am, and I'm doing it. And this is not something I'm totally comfortable with. This is kind of how I feel. I'm just jumping, and probably I'm going to smash my face and make a fool out of myself, which I might be doing. However, the more you do it, the better you get. And everyone has excuses, right? And we hear a lot of the same excuses from developers who have really good ideas. They're working on really cool stuff, and we ask them to present, and there's like a theme. There's a few that always come up. One of them is, I'm not an expert, or I don't know enough. I guarantee that everyone in this room knows more than most of the other people about something. There's always someone who knows less than you do about some topic, right? Or maybe you just have a better way of doing things. You know, figured out a problem and you were able to, you know, you had this really cool way of fixing it. And that needs to be shared, like, because maybe somebody else is having the same problem, or lots of people. This guy did a TED Talk on how to tie your shoes. Pretty sure everyone here knows how to tie their shoes. However, it's 2 minutes and 52 seconds of him like teaching a lot of people in this huge audience how to tie their shoes the right way, because apparently we're all doing it wrong. So it doesn't have to be super complicated. It doesn't have to be, you know, some crazy high level topic. Like, it can be something simple that you just know a lot about, or are passionate about, or you just do differently, and someone will find value in that. The other point here is the best way to understand something like deeply is to teach it. The more you prepare to teach and, you know, prepare to present, you're learning about things in a different way and at a different level. Also, it gives people, when you do present it, you'll get questions, and maybe they're questions that you never thought of before, or you know, problems that someone has run into with what you're talking about. And so it teaches you, so it gives you value as well, and you're learning at the same time. Also, I'm not good at presenting, and I've never presented before. Yeah, me. I'm not good at presenting. But the more you do it, the better you get. So how many people in here have presented at this meetup or another meetup? I know there are a few. Okay, so how many of you didn't think that you were going to be awesome at presenting before you presented? Yeah, but then you did it anyway, right? And it went okay. And how many of you have continued to present? Yeah, see? And the more you do it, the better you get. So that's not a good excuse. I don't have time. This one can totally be a reasonable excuse, but we're all super busy. If you choose a topic that you're really comfortable speaking about, and you could talk about it for 30 minutes, then you probably have time. I put this together. I'm not an expert. I'm not good at presenting. I threw some slides together today, and it didn't take very much time because I just already knew what I was going to talk about. Also, Jesse Sanders, who presents all over the place at conferences and meetups here and across the country, this is where he's done some of his biggest presentations. He's put them together on the plane ride to wherever he's going because he already knew the content. So he just put some slides together with his talk points. And as long as you have these like anchors of what you're talking about, it sort of reminds you. And then, you know, so it doesn't actually have to take that much time. And finally, I can't decide what to talk about. Like, you just have so many things, or maybe you think well, something's a good idea, but maybe other people won't. Talk to your coworkers and talk to friends and talk to people at the meetups. We have almost 2,000 people in the Rocky Mountain Angular meetup group. Obviously, not all of them are active still. Some of them probably don't live here. However, you could probably go in there and look through the members, find some people that are familiar, and send them a message. and be like, hey, these are some of the things that I was thinking about presenting on. What would you like to hear? You know, what do you want to know about? There's also the Slack channels. You can ask people in there. There's, is it Angular Colorado? Or yeah, Angular Colorado, Slack, Denver Devs, right? Yeah. And then, you know, there are others that are specific to Angular and JavaScript, and just talk to people. You'll get ideas. And finally, if you have an idea, but you just need help like getting started, or you need some more tips, you can reach out to us. I have some resources. I'll probably list them, or I will. I'll list them in the comments of this meetup page. And I'll do that today or tomorrow. And it's like resources on how to present. And Dan actually had a really good book that he suggested called what is it?
Presentation Zen.
Yeah, Presentation Zen.
It's easy to read.
Yeah, so I'll throw that link up there. And you can always email us, meetups at BrieBug. Email me, jessica.arber@briebug.com, or Jesse, and just talk to us. And Jesse's willing to help. Like, I probably wouldn't be the best person to be like, here, let me show you how to present. Jesse totally would, but I can always give resources. So yeah, we just want more. And like, if you guys want to come suggest meetups to me or topics, like at any of the meetups that I'm at, feel free. Like, we're always open for that. So that's my talk. Thanks, guys. So, oh, and I guess I can present or introduce Brian. So Brian's up next. Do you want to do it? No? Okay. So Brian is up next. He's going to be talking about Angular schematics. He is the BrieBug CTO and was recently designated a Google Developer Expert in Angular very recently. So we're super excited about that. And yeah, so here's Brian.
Cool. Some tea over here.
It's you. Do you want the mic? I didn't even use it.
I think I'll have the mic.
Okay.
Because I feel like I yelled a lot at Develop Denver. Jason knows what I'm talking about. You know, I went to another talk in that same room, Jason, and I had no problem. Next.
And then share your screen.
Where is that? Oh, over here. Present a share, screen share. Your entire screen. Am I supposed to mute or do anything else, or is that it? Do you want to test it real quick, or we'll just go? Okay. Oh, let me back this up. Sweet. Okay, thanks guys for coming out. Oh, let me turn this on just so I don't have to. Cool. Can you hear me? Awesome. Okay, it's just another Schematic Monday, so we're chilling. Thanks for coming out to the Rocky Mountain Angular meetup. Quick show of hands, who's done any development with Angular schematics? Got it. Kevin, Ron, you did some? Cool, man. And you played with it last night. Yeah. So he's like, yeah. Cool. I do want to. I don't have a slide on this, but I was kind of talking to Anthony about this. So this is definitely a topic that's, I think, very related to Angular, but we're actually not going to be doing any Angular tonight, right? So the schematics uses kind of its own library, its own CLI. It's kind of this whole little animal that lives alongside of Angular. and is developed alongside of Angular at Google. And so everybody knows what schematics are, right? Or should I go into that first? We're good? Yeah, okay, cool. So yeah, let's dive in. Jessica already introduced me, but I'm the CTO here at BrieBug, and as you just heard, I just recently became a Google Developer Expert in Angular. Before I get started, I've been doing this lately with some of my talks. I want to thank some people because a lot of the content you're going to see that I'm going to present on, obviously, I've learned it from a lot of other people. I've followed other people. I've read a lot of articles. So definitely a big thank you to Hans and the Angular team for schematics. Kevin, sitting right up here in the front left, has done a lot of schematics here at BrieBug. And certainly leaned on him a bunch of times in preparing for this talk. And then I also want to thank my wife, Bonnie, because I've spent like the last 3 Saturdays like just in front of my computer for 6 hours a day learning schematics. And she's just like, what are you doing? And I'm like, I got to get ready for this talk. And so a big thank you to her and her patience in letting me do that. So cool. So why schematics? Well, the CLI uses schematics. You're probably already aware of this. So you're using schematics today. When you ng new, you're using schematics. When you ng generate a component, you're using a schematic. And so we'll take a quick look at building a schematic for a component, and kind of so that way you get an understanding of how it's done for you. And then maybe you can go out there and kind of learn and say, oh, well, I can do this on my own. I could take this back to my organization and build some schematics around what we're doing. The other reason why you might be interested in schematics is you don't want to repeat yourself. One of the things that Anthony was mentioning is every time he creates an Angular material dialogue, he feels like he's constantly repeating himself. Like, okay, we got to inject this, we got to do this, we got to do that. And it starts to become kind of the same thing over and over again. And that's where you could start to build a collection of schematics, either for yourself or for your organization, where you're doing repetitive tasks perhaps in your job already, and you could start to automate those with schematics and share them out with the community. You can also enforce architecture and consistency with schematics. Perhaps there's a specific architecture or a specific pattern that you're doing at your organization. Maybe it's something around logging, for example. Let's say every component you want to log for lifecycle hook. So you want to log for various things that might be happening in that component. So every person goes out and like copy pastes the component that they did before, and they bring it over to their new component, and they bring in the logger, and they add everything that they need in order to kind of meet that consistency. Or perhaps it's some sort of architecture that your organization has decided upon, and you want to enforce that. And so we can do that through schematics by building a custom schematic that builds out these files or whatever it is that we need to do. This other one on number 4, this probably doesn't apply to most people in this room, but if you are building a library, it'd be really nice if you have schematics for your library. So somebody could ng add your library or ng update your library, right? So whatever kind of library, maybe you're building something around like Google Maps, for example. It'd be really nice if somebody could just ng add Google Maps and boom, it just sucks everything in and it's good to go, right? Or something like that. Of course, you know, I realize that most of us aren't doing library development, but you can also contribute to the open source community, and you could write a schematic for a library out there. One of the things I did, and I don't have it, I talked to David East, who's on the Firebase team, but I actually wrote a schematic to ng add Angular Fire. It's relatively simple to add Angular Fire. If you've ever done it, it's like 3 or 4 steps, and it probably took me about 8 hours to develop an ng add for it, but it was really fun to be able to learn it. And then we could you know, break down those barriers for people that maybe want to use that library or whatever it is. So before we get started, let's go over quick some frequently asked questions maybe about schematics, kind of get some stuff out of the way. Schematics are generators that transform an existing file system. Under the hood, schematics are kind of like a build system maybe, or maybe like a generator like Yeoman or something like that. And what they do is they allow you to create files, refactor existing files, and move files around. And that's pretty much it. But it gets really complex when you want to, like, let's say, add a particular class to an import of a decorator for an ng module or something like that. That kind of becomes pretty hard to do. And you would think it's kind of trivial, like, oh, maybe we'll just do a regex and find a position and drop it here. It's like, you know, it's a little harder than that. And we'll take a look at some of that stuff. I will say this talk is going to be, we're going to kind of touch the surface of schematics, and you can really take a deep dive into schematics and learn all the ins and outs. The other thing you might be asking yourself is, okay, well, is this Angular specific? And the way I think about it is, no, not really. It certainly is developed alongside of Angular, and it comes out of, the Angular community is certainly the ecosystem that's primarily using schematics. But that doesn't mean that this has to be something specific to Angular. If you're a React developer, you could use schematics just as well. You probably need to be using TypeScript because a lot of the schematics is built around TypeScript and parsing the TypeScript files and these kinds of things. But you could certainly use schematics outside of Angular. And then, of course, we've already mentioned this, but we've got the CLI integration. So it's already schematics is under the hood in the CLI, if you will, for ng-add, ng-generate, and ng-update. Before I get into actually building a schematic, I thought this would be valuable because this is one of the things I learned as part of this preparing for this talk is configuring schematics. And so you may be aware that in Angular 6, we got this new angular.json file, right? And you might have looked through it and you're like, wow, this is all kind of crazy. I don't really know what's going on here. But one of the things that you can do with Angular JSON files, you can actually configure the Angular, CLI ng schematics. You can set the default collection, and you might have done that if you've used like the Norwal schematics or the NGRX schematics. And one of the steps is like, oh, you have to set this this default or something like that. So you might have done that before. One thing that's kind of neat is you can actually configure some default values around the options that you pass into schematics. So for example, let's say, here's a really simple one. Every time you generate a component, let's say you're using SCSS, like the new version of Sass, right? For your preprocessor for CSS. And every time you generate a component, you got to do -- style extension equals SCSS, right? Well, what if you could just configure it every time it generates to just make it SCSS? Well, you can do that, right? And so we can configure schematics in Angular JSON. And so here is a brief example. So here's an Angular JSON file. I have got my app, it's just called my app. And underneath my app, you're going to find a property called schematics. And underneath that schematics, you can actually start adding some stuff to it. So you can add things to configure the component schematic. And you can say, hey, I want the style extension to be by default SCSS. Or I always want to have inline templates and inline styles. That's something that you like to do. Or I always want change detection to be on push for this whenever I generate a component. And this is kind of neat. This is not, you're not building your own schematic, but you can just walk away with this, and hopefully maybe this is even helpful for some of the people in the room. And you can say, oh, wow, I do that every time, or every time I generate a component, I forget about it, and I have to go and change the file extension to SCSS. Just go ahead and make that change right now, if that's something that you're doing. And of course, there's other configure options for pipes and modules and services and these kinds of things. What's nice also, I will say, if you're using VS Code, and I imagine WebStorm does the same thing, or most editors that you might be using, it's got a schema defined. And so when you actually go in here, you actually get IntelliSense in your editor. And so you can actually kind of discover some of the options that go along with these configurations. Or you can go and look at the docs, of course. Oh, I guess I have another example, configuring a module, for example. Let's say every time you gen out a module, you want routing. And instead of having to get that option, we can set routing to true, and these kinds of things. So you can kind of play with those on your own and discover them as you will. Okay, before we dive in, and I hate to put this much slides up before talking about code, but I almost have to. And I reordered this deck like 3 times in the last day. But I think we do need to talk about some terminology first. And I'm going to go over this. Just kind of keep these in the back of your mind as we dive into some of the schematics. And so hopefully this will clear up when we look at some of the code and talk about the schematic CLI and stuff. So a collection is a list of schematics metadata. And there's actually a file, a collection file, collection.json, right? And schematics can be referred by name inside of a collection. And so we'll see that. And so you can see here I've got a simple like ngg, short for generate. And then I have a collection, colon, and then the name of the schematic. And so a collection, just like it sounds, can have multiple schematics inside of it. The tree is a staging area for all your changes. And we'll see there's a class called tree, and we'll use that to create files or to delete, rename, move, that kind of stuff. It's a staging area for changes that contains the original file system and a list of changes to apply to it. And this is actually kind of an important point. Let me just stop here for a second. because you may be thinking, oh, wow, schematics is just like a generator. Like, why do we need this like really complex set of classes and utilities around all of this? And one of the things that's really powerful about schematics is you can do a sequence of changes to your file system. And if anything goes wrong, you can undo it all because it just kind of happens in this like staging area, in this tree, right? And so if anything happens down the path, you don't have to worry about rolling back all the things that you did to the file system, right? So for whatever reason, something errors out. So that's what one of the benefits about the tree is. It kind of keeps this list of changes, and then we can go ahead and apply those changes and write it out to the file system. Okay, a rule is a function that applies actions to a tree. So it returns a new tree, that would be the tree with your changes applied to it, that will contain all the transformations that are to be applied. The source is a function that creates an entirely new tree from an empty file system. So we can just create a new tree. And finally, action is an atomic operation to be validated and committed to a file system or a tree. And actions are created by schematics, and we'll see that. Oh, sorry, one more. And then the sync, you don't really need to know this, but it's the final destination for every action. All right, we got that all out of the way. Let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing you need to do when you're working with schematics is install the CLI. And this is not the Angular CLI, this is a different CLI. So you need to go ahead and install that, and we're going to install that globally. And it's at angular-devkit/schematics-CLI. After that, you'll have a schematic CLI, and that's the name, like NG. It's schematics is going to be what you'll use to actually create schematics and run them locally. So then the next thing we'll do is we'll create a blank project. So we'll use we just installed the schematic CLI. So we'll use the schematic CLI. That's the binary up there, right? Schematics. And we're going to go ahead and create a new blank schematic. So we'll call it, the blank is kind of the command that we're going to use. And then we're going to give it a name. And so this, I gave it Hello World Angular Schematic. And just like when you ng new my app or something like that, it'll actually create a folder, in this case, Hello World Angular Schematic. And it's a schematic itself. So you're actually using schematics to make a schematic, which is interesting. It will create all the file structures and yarn install or npm install of your dependencies. And you'll be up and ready to go and get started with a schematic. So that's all we have to do. After that, let's go ahead and go into that directory. I'm going to go ahead and git init. And then finally, the other thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to add a couple of, oh, that's right. That's why I added this slide. They just updated the schematics to 7.0.2 with the version 7 release of Angular. And so the schematics, when you actually do schematics blank, at least this was for me, and your mileage may vary, especially in the future. When I built that blank schematic, the dependencies were on the old versions of the DevKit core and the DevKit schematic. So make sure you're on the latest version, so that way you get the latest code. So just go ahead and install those latest versions. Okay, cool. So we've created a schematic. The first thing we want to do is go ahead and open up the source collection.json file. Inside the collection.json file is where we're going to define all of our schematics. We've got a schema up top that's going to be there for you already. Just to note, the only line that wasn't in this file when I generated it was the schema. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and give it the name of our schematic. So in this case, it's Hello World. You give it a quick description. And the important part is the factory property here, or the factory option. So the factory option, we're going to give it a directory. It's kind of like, think about when you do load children, when you're doing lazy load in Angular, you give it like the load children to string rather than a reference to the actual module, right? So we're going to give it a path to the index file that it created as well when we created the blank schematic. And then it uses a # and then the function that it's going to run, basically like your entry function, right? You can ignore that if you want and just export a default function out of that TypeScript file. So you can either name the function. So in this case, I'd have an export function called Hello World, and that's the function that it would run initially when you run the schematic. Or we could just get rid of the # and the Hello World here, and it'll just look for a default function that's exported out of that index file and run that. And then finally, let's go ahead and define a schema. The schema is optional, but you're pretty much going to want to do it. Schema is going to be a JSON file that you're going to define. And that's the schema for your specific schematic. and that'll define all of the options that the user would enter on the command line, as well as any of the, Anthony just mentioned that in version 7, the CLI dropped with prompts. So if you go out and install the latest CLI and ng new, you'll notice you're going to get prompts for like whether you want routing and these kinds of things. So that's kind of a new feature of the CLI and schematics. And so you can do prompts as well and define them inside your schema.json file. Okay, let's take a quick look. Let's first create that schema.json file. And let's go and take a look at that. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to give it an ID and a title, not really super important, and a type. And then the properties is where we're going to really dive into the different properties and options for our schematic. So in this case, I've defined a property. It's got the name of name, and it's a string. And we've got a description that goes along with it. It says the name of the person that you want to wave to. And then I can also define a default value. Without the $, you can just give it a default value, or with the $, default, you can actually define that this is going to be an argument variable at index 0, and that's going to be passed in to our CLI or into our schematic. Finally, after your properties, you can also define which properties are required by the user to enter. And if they don't provide that property, in this example, name, the schematic will throw an error and say, you need to provide a name for this. And that is an array, right? So you can have multiple required properties. Okay, let's go ahead and dive into the hello world, the actual file here. So this is my hello world function that we defined in the schema, or excuse me, in the collection.json file. And the first thing you're going to notice is I get an options. Those options, that's what the user entered in on the command line interface, on the command line. That's what they entered, and you're going to get those values into this first argument into your function. In this instance, I've given it a type of any. I would strongly encourage you, and I've seen a lot of examples where you're going to strongly type that. So define an interface. You might call it schema. I have in an example we're going to see here in a minute. And so that way we get some, because it's all in TypeScript, right? That way I'm going to get some IntelliSense and some type checking around the actual options that I've defined in my schema.json and what's being used in my code. You'll notice that my function is going to return a rule. And then I have, it's basically, I think they call this a rule factory function because the hello world is a factory function. So it returns a function, right? And it's going to return a function, and that function is a rule. And that function accepts the tree, which is the current kind of state of our files system, and then the context, and that's our schematic context. And then the next thing we'll do is we'll go ahead and create a new file in the tree. So we'll invoke tree.create, and we'll pass in the file name. In this instance, it's hello world.html, and then the content that we're going to put inside that file. So pretty easy, right? I'm also using options.name, which we saw was specified in the schema file. And in between there, we're just going to do hello, and then whatever the name is, and then a little wave. And then we return our tree. And I'm pretty sure you always have to return the tree. Is that right? Yeah. I might be referencing Kevin throughout this talk because Kevin has definitely helped me along the way and knows a lot about schematics as well. So real quickly, this is not the entire interface for the tree. Just so you know kind of some of the various options that are available to you when working with a tree. You can obviously read files, and that'll return a buffer. You can see if a file exists or a path exists in the tree. You can create. And then you get this thing called a recorder. And we kind of won't go too deep into this. But you can start updating files in a tree based on a recorded set of actions that you have created that you're going to write against a file or something like that. So that's where you can start to begin your update, perform those updates, and then commit them. Okay, cool. So this was super easy. This was just a hello world example. The next thing that we need to do is obviously we need to build it because it's TypeScript. This is all, I'm using Yarn. You can use NPM. This is going to come, the build command's already defined for you in package.json when you generate out the blank schematic. So let's go ahead and run it. You'll see that I'm going to use the schematic CLI to run the schematic itself. And the first thing you're going to notice is I've got the dot, period. And I'm basically saying in the current directory, there's a collection. And then we're going to do colon, and then followed by the schematic name. So in our instance, we created a schematic called hello world. and it's in the current directory. So we just do .:hello world, and that's the schematic that we're going to execute. And then in the first instance, there's 2 lines, right? In the first one, I'm going to go ahead and just provide that name right on the command line, just Denver, and then do dry run equals false. I will note that when you're running the schematic CLI, you're actually running in like a debug mode. So nothing will actually happen unless you put dry run equals false. It just runs in a dry run. So we'll do that. And then the second example, we can just specify the option using -- name equals Denver. So okay, so let's go ahead and run that. And just like you would see in the Angular CLI, you're going to see that, hey, we got this like create, and it says it created hello world.html, and it's 26 bytes. And then if we go ahead and we cat that, I don't know why I have hello world cat. This was an accident. Sorry about that. If I go ahead and cat that, you're going to see that it says hello Denver, right? So it filled in the place where we had that kind of the string interpolation. So super, super easy. I don't think this is going to be very beneficial for you when you get to work, so we're going to dive into something a little bit more complex here in a couple of minutes. I do want to mention also that you can unit test schematics as well, which is really powerful. So there's a schematic test runner, and we can new that up and provide it our the schematics collection path, and we point it to the collection.json file that we defined for our schematic. And then using the runner, we can run the schematic using the run schematic method and tell it what schematic that we want to run. In this instance, we're going to run the hello world schematic. I'm going to give it no options in this instance and then an empty tree. And then I can expect that the tree file's length is now going to be equal to 1 because I created a new file called hello world. So it went up 1. Cool. So that was a simple hello world example. It's kind of give you a little taste of what a schematic is like to build it and kind of operate inside of this schematics world. So let's dive in a little bit deeper. And what I wanted to do in this instance, I thought this was a good example. I actually I talked to a bunch of people about different examples of why you might use schematics or opportunities to use schematics in organizations. And one of the things that I thought was really simple, first of all, because I wanted to start simple, was the ability to build what I would call like a container component, right? So every time I create a container, what I call a container component, and what I mean by a container is a stateful component that will usually have either the NGRX store or I'm injecting services into it. And as a result of using either the NGRX store or services, I'm working with observables. And we all know that we have to deal with this thing like unsubscribing from observables. And my favorite way to deal with unsubscribing from observables is the take until operator in RxJS. But that requires me to define a couple of like maybe boilerplate, if you will, kind of stub out some things. In this instance, I could show you, but I'll just talk about it. I pretty much every time I'm going to create a container component, and I know I'm using an observable, I need to create a subject. I'll usually call it like unsubscribe or destroy. So I create a private property in my class called unsubscribe, and I set it equal to a new subject. I've got to import the subject class from RxJS. I then have to implement onDestroy for my component lifecycle hook. I have to define ng onDestroy, the method itself, and then I have to take the subject and next it and complete it. And then I'll also need to import take until the operator, so that way in my observable streams, I can pipe to take until and pass it my subject, which if you haven't used take until, once my subject nexts a new notification, it'll basically complete all of my subscriptions. So I wanted to use Angular schematics to create a container component that was very simple and easy. So that way, every time I need to create a container component, I can just ng-gen it, and I'm good to go. And I don't need to do all those steps that I just listed off to you. So the first thing to know about the schematics when it comes into actual like files. So before we just did tree create, right? And we created this hello world file. But as you can imagine, like defining templates and files, and imagine you're creating all kinds of stuff, that can be really complex if we got to define that all in our code base. So schematics has a really nice way for us to define files in a schematic that it will use a templating engine on. So when I say templating engine, think about like, even when you're doing Angular, right, you're actually using a templating engine. When you're doing like star or asterisk ng4, that's not HTML, right? I mean, it's a templating engine that the renderer is processing. And so a similar kind of concept occurs in schematics. So in this instance, underneath my container component, that's the name. So collection.json, we saw that earlier. Container component is the name of my schematic. And I create a directory called files, and that's the default. And underneath files, I'm going to go ahead and create a new directory called __name at _rise, and then at if flat. So only use a directory if it's going to be flat, right? Yeah, that's going to check for that Boolean value if that's true. Yeah, thank you. And then this is going to _rise my name. So if I give it a name that's maybe camel case or something like that, it's going to _rise the name of that component for me. And then I'm going to go ahead and create 4 new files, just like you would see in the CLI if you ng-gen the component. I'm going to have a styles file. I'm going to have an HTML template, and my spec, and my component TypeScript file. Also notice that we've got this __ style ext, and this will be replaced by whatever the user specifies for the style extension in the CLI. Just like if you're ng-generating a component now and you say style extension equals SCSS, we want that extension to be that, right? And so we create some of these files, and we'll take a look at the templates inside of those files here in a second. These files are what we're going to use, kind of use as our template when we go ahead and generate out a new component. And it'll contain a lot of Angular code, but also a lot of Angular schematic template code, so that way we can evaluate string expressions inside of it. We've got some if statements and these kinds of things inside of it. Okay, so let's take a look at our index.ts file for this schematic. In this instance, I'm exporting a default function, so I didn't give it a name. And then in my schema or my collection.json file, I can just point it to this index file. And I'm going to go ahead and specify a schema interface for the options. And so this is very similar to what we saw before. I will note this real quick. You'll see that I called the first argument into the rule host. It seems to be kind of becoming a standard if you look at a lot of the schematics that are built by either the material team or Angular CLI team. I don't know why they don't call it tree. They tend to call it host. So that's what I did here. And then we've got our schematic context. And we've got a couple to-dos here. So the first thing we want to do is we want to validate and configure our options. And those are the options that are coming in into that, the first argument there into our function. And then we want to copy any files that we saw out of the files directory that we just saw. And we're going to generate those templates. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to chain together a whole bunch of rules using this function called chain. Okay. So inside of our function, let's go ahead and make sure that we have a project. So if it's not defined, we've got a schematic exception that we can throw, and that'll throw out a user like a friendly error message to the user that says the option project is required. And then we'll go ahead and get the workspace project using this get project function that's defined in the utility directory underneath schematics Angular. Then we're going to determine the path. And we can do this 2 ways. We can have the user specify the paths when we want to generate the component, or we can also determine the path based on angular.json. So in angular.json, you can define multiple projects now. In the path, or the path to each project is defined inside of there. And so we can use this build default path function to get the default path for our project. Finally, we're going to be modifying a module in this case. So when we generate out a component, we want to declare it in our module, right? So we need to find which module to use. And that will be based upon the location of where I'm generating the component. It'll basically traverse up the tree until it gets to the app module. And the first ng module it finds, that's the module that we're going to use, and that's where we'll declare our component. Oh, again, this also comes out. You'll notice this quite a bit. This function comes out of the schematics Angular utility folder as well. And you're going to spend a fair amount of time in that directory kind of discovering some of the functions that are available to you. All right, finally, let's go ahead and determine our name and path. So we'll use parse name. Again, that comes out of the utility directory. So that way we get a normalized name and path for the new component. And part of that normalization, just so you know, has to do with Windows uses backslashes, and everybody else in the world uses forward slashes. So it just changes them all to forward slashes because Windows will accept that as well. Let's go ahead and determine what our selector is going to be. The user can specify the selector. So think when you're generating a component, we can specify what we want the selector to be for that if it's not going to just kind of be defaulted for us based on the name of the component. So we could have a custom selector. That could be an option that we specify when we generate a component. Or if it's not specified, we'll use this build selector function that is actually defined in this file. That's why it's not imported. And we'll kind of build out. We'll just grab whatever the default is for the prefix, which is defined in angular.json as well. In most cases, by default, when you create a new Angular project, it's just app. So we'll determine what that prefix is, and then dash it, and we'll determine what the rest of the selector is going to be. It's going to be a dasherized version of whatever the name is. Okay, we're racing towards the finish line. The next thing we want to do is we want to apply the rules to our source. So we'll use this function called URL, and we'll give it a path to our files directory. And then it's going to go ahead and return actually a source. That's the class that it's going to return. And we'll provide that into our apply function. And we're going to apply a series of rules, I think. Yes, rules to the files in that directory. And what we want to do is, as part of generating out a component, you can define a couple of things like, do we want to have a spec file, right? You can -- no spec if you want to. I wouldn't say that you should, but you can do that. You can do different things like your style extension and these kinds of things. So we're going to filter out any of the files in that files directory we just saw based on the options that the user specifies. We want to then compile the templates using all these options that we've specified into the templates that we've defined in that files directory. And then finally, we want to move those files to the options.path. Okay. Take a breather. How you guys doing? Good. It's heavy. I get it. I'm trying. When I was approaching this, I was like, man, this is like teaching Angular in 45 minutes. I don't know if this is possible, but I thought, why not? I could do it. So, if anything, I do hope that you come out of this and you're like, wow, this is really cool. And I got some resources at the end, but hopefully out of this, you will not maybe know how to build a schematic and all the details that we're kind of going through, but hopefully get inspired to go out and learn and to build something. So, okay, so here's the first thing that we wanted to do, right? We want to filter out some stuff. So let's go ahead and if the user said that they want a spec, we're not going to do anything. We're not going to filter anything. So we'll just do a no op. That's one of our functions that we get. Otherwise, let's go ahead and get rid of anything that ends with spec.ts and filter that out of our files directory because they said they don't want a spec file for whatever reason. Let's say the user said they want inline styles. If that's the case, we don't need that style file. So let's go ahead and filter that out as well. And then finally, if they want inline templates, we'll go ahead and we'll filter out anything in the files directory that ends with .html. So we'll just do some filtering out of those files before we move them over. Oh, I have some really nice arrows to go along with that. Okay, so now that we've done that, the next step is we're going to use this template function, which is provided, again, by Schematics. And we're going to run against our template all of the options that we've specified. And one of the things, so we import this strings. I didn't show this, but we import strings. And remind me what the strings are, Kevin. Do you know? Do you remember?
I believe it's all the dasherized.
It is. Thank you. Yes. So built into this strings object is a whole bunch of helper functions that you're going to use inside the template to do things like classify, like to change like a string to like a class name, because class name should be like upper camel case, or to dasherize things like selector should be dasherized, right? So whatever the name is that you provide it, we want to dasherize it or upper camel case it for class names and these kinds of things. I think maybe there's the if is in there. There's a couple other functions that are in there that you can use inside your template. And we'll take a quick look at that. And then we want to spread out our options. And those are the options that the user specified and then we kind of created in the beginning of this. So that's what we do. We run this template function against our templates. And then finally, we're going to go ahead and move those files after they've run through the template function into our sink. Yes. Oh no, this last one moved the files into the path, but just inside the tree. So it actually didn't write them. I'm sorry. And then finally, we want to use the chain function, and we're going to chain together a couple of rules. And we're going to merge with all the template stuff that we just did up above. And then finally, after we do all that template stuff, we might want to apply some sort of lint fix. And I got this out of the built-in component CLI or schematic. And so this is what they kind of do. So as a last step, after you've modified all those files and done everything inside the tree, we want to then go ahead and apply any sort of lint fix if that's an option that you've specified. Okay. I do want to mention some of the functions that we talked about that came out of the dev kit schematics. Just so I mentioned them, but let's just quickly recap on them. So that way, when you get started with this tonight after you get home, you're like, yay, schematics. Yeah, everybody's like, yeah, right. So that way, when you decide, like your boss is like, we want a schematic, you're like, okay, fine. Let me go back and watch on YouTube Brian's talk and look at his thing. So the URL, that returns a source. We talked about this for a given URL string, and we import that, out of the dev kit schematics. We talked about apply. That applies multiple rule functions to a source and then returns that source transformed. We talked, you saw the no-op function briefly. All it does is just returns a rule that performs no action. So we saw that in our ternary operator when we just don't want to do anything. So we just have this simple function that they provide us. Filter will filter a tree using a file predicate function. And template transforms the file path and contents using the schematics templating syntax. Move will move the tree to a specified destination. And chains together multiple rules into a single rule that we return out of our function. So I do want to, before we jump into that, let's take a quick look at, so here's the schematic. Let me bring this down. Can you guys see this in VS Code? I tried to bump it up a bit. Bigger, smaller, good? Good, cool. So this is kind of the default function that this is all put together, everything that you just we ran through piece by piece. And so you can see where we're kind of building up this options object with all of our options and values that are going to go into our template. Here's our template source, where we did we applied all of the template stuff to our files. And then finally, when we chain everything down at the bottom and return out the single rule from the chain. Let's quickly take a look at the files. So if we look at the style sheet, it's empty because that's how the style sheets come. You could obviously put something in here. If there's like you want to import, every time you generate a component, you've got some root or some base styles or maybe some variables, like if you're using Sass. Maybe you've got a whole bunch of variables that you use for like colors and spacing and on all these kinds of things. So you could import that every time. You could easily just put this in here and just say, hey, import whatever it is. Let's take a look next at the actual TypeScript file. So you're gonna look at this in, we're all Angular developers, I assume, or at least we've seen some Angular, right? And you're gonna say, well, this looks a little bit like a component, but it's got all this funny stuff around it. And these are these functions that came out of the, not options, strings, right? So we can dasherize, and here's our selector. And we use this little bracket % equals templating structure to do string interpolation to evaluate that string inside of our template. We also have an if statement. So we say if the user wants view encapsulation, then we want to add the view encapsulation to the import out of Angular core, right? So this is kind of cool. One of the things I think that's really kind of cool about this is you're using schematics today. This is what's actually running under the hood every time you gen out a component. And so, if you give it a change detection strategy, that comes in. If you have styles, whether they're inline or not inline, if you're pointing to a URL, That all kind of happens there. And so this is my schematic for the container component. So you're going to see a couple of things that I talked about. So here's my unsubscribe and my new subject. And I've got subject up here I'm importing. And then here's take until. So that way it's available to use in my pipe down in my component. I've got onDestroy here and onDestroy up there, right? So I'm bringing that in. And then here's my ng onDestroy lifecycle method, where I'm nexting on my unsubscribe observable and then completing that observable as well. So not a whole lot in addition to maybe a general component that you're kind of building. But what's kind of nice is this is something that I'm doing over and over again. And so now that I have this, it's done. So, and then here's the template. You know, you could also define, let's say you were creating in your organization schematics to build out specific containers or widgets or I don't know, whatever it is. And you always want to have some sort of template maybe kind of there instead of just like it works or whatever it comes with by default, right? This is where you could define it. And again, I'm going to dasherize the name and just say works and then a rocket. So yeah. So nothing really crazy different than what you would see when you generate a standard component. Okay, let me get a drink of water. Whew. So this next, the next section I want to talk about is like a sandbox, and this idea comes from Kevin, and I really like it because I started to do some schematic development, within an existing library just by adding like a schematics folder and stuff. It actually can be kind of hard to test your schematic. You can definitely unit test it. Don't hear me wrong, but I mean maybe it's just me, but I'm kind of a visual person, and I want to see. Okay, when I actually run this schematic, like I actually want to see it run against like an Angular app. Like I want to see it like build out the files and make sure it works. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new Angular project, new Angular app inside of our repository called Sandbox. And then we're going to link the Sandbox so that way we can run our schematics from it. And then we're just going to run our container component just like we would using the Angular CLI. So ngg for generate, and then we'll give it our schematics, and then the schematic, that's the collection name. And then the schematic that we want to run is the container component schematic that we've been building. So let's take a look at a demo. So here was the code. Make sure I undo that. Cool. So in my package.json, I've got a couple of additional scripts, but in general, I'm going to go ahead and just build out my schematic, and then I want to test it. And by testing it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just clean up my sandbox every time I test, and then I'm going to go ahead and run that schematic, and then after that, I'm going to test my sandbox using linting. I'll lint it and run my unit tests and my end-to-end tests. So we come down in our terminal. I just build it. Everything builds, and that's it. I will say it's just using the TypeScript compiler, and it's not building. It's not like using Webpack or anything crazy, right? So it literally just here's the TS file, and it just drops the JS and the map right in the same directory. So just make sure you don't commit those to your source control. And then let's go ahead and test it. Oh, before I do that, let me just show you. So the sandbox is clean. I don't have any Git changes on it. And what we're going to do is inside app, we're going to generate a new component. We'll just call it foo or something like that. And we're going to generate out a new app. And it should hopefully look like the container component that I'm trying to build. Come on. Oh, look at this. I did prompts. I forgot to mention how to do prompts. I'll circle back on that. If you haven't used the new Angular 7 CLI, you can see in this instance, I didn't provide the name of the component as part of the ngg command. So because I didn't, and it's required in my schema, we're going to go ahead and prompt the user and say, okay, well, what's the name that you'd like to use for your component? And so we'll do RMA, Rocky Mountain Angular. No! Oh, I ran into this. I don't know why it's trying to the DS store file. Oh no, this is in Sandbox. Hold on. Okay. Try it again. What is that thing for anyways? Does anybody know? It's a Mac thing, right? Okay, but nobody knows. It's just there. So, okay, sure. Whatever Mac, whatever you need. I think it has something to do with like it's OS 9. Wow. Wow. Oh, geez, I don't want to do all this. Oh, cancel this. It's running my whole unit test. I mean, it passes, but we don't need to run all that. Cool. So what we should see is just what we expect when we generate a component is, yeah, see, there's my DS store file. How did that get into my schematic? I have no, I'll have to look at that. So anyways, what I did create though is I created a new RMA directory for Rocky Mountain Angular, and I've got a new Rocky Mountain Angular component, and there's my CSS, my HTML, my spec, and my TypeScript, my component. So now if we come into here, and this is what I really like about this sandbox development approach, I can actually see this. And so now I can come in here and I can see, oh sweet, here's my TypeScript file, and there's take until, and there's my subject, and here's my unsubscribe, and I'm ready to go. Right? I've already got it all wired up. This is a very simple example, but obviously you could build upon this and say, oh wow, we're going to enforce building whatever patterns it is that you do at your organization, or whatever structure it is that you want to do with a schematic. So yeah, so that's a quick demo. Oops, I want to show that. How do I get back to my, oh, there it is. Okay, so if you want to get started on your own, feel free to check it out. I pushed this up to GitHub yesterday, I think. So you can go ahead and clone out. It's under my BLove account on github.com, and it's called Schematics. So you can go ahead and clone that out and go into it. Just install. Got to go into the sandbox as well and install the Angular, your application dependencies as well. And then you can go ahead and build and test and run it yourself. So feel free to check it out. Cool. How are we doing? Oh, not bad. All right. So how do I get started? The first thing that you want to do, and I didn't learn about this until afterwards, so this is a nugget of information, hopefully. So along with the blank schematic that you can build from the Schematics CLI, you actually can build a schematic, which will build, instead of a blank one, it actually builds like this whole sample for you, which is actually pretty neat. So if you do schematic, and then just give it a name, it'll build out a whole sample and a bunch of different schematics and kind of show you. And it actually, I didn't get to this part in my talk, but it'll show you how one schematic can actually run another schematic, so you can kind of run them in series. So definitely go check that out. The other thing you can do is you can check out, I've got a couple of repositories that I've created just while playing with schematics over the last couple of weeks. The Hello World schematic that you saw in the beginning. There's that other schematics with the container in it. And then I wrote, like I mentioned, an Angular Fire schematics as well, which is a little bit more tricky because you have to go into the environments file and add environment configurations. And so that was interesting. And we're not going to go into that tonight. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, you can hit me up on Twitter or something. We can do a hangout and I can show you how I did it. Definitely check out this blog post by Hans, the schematics introduction. I think that's from earlier this year. And then also the CLI repository is really helpful if you want to look at how they built schematics. So you can go to, instead of Angular/Angular on GitHub, go to Angular/Angular CLI. And then also the material team as well has developed a bunch of really good schematics. And so I think it's always good to look at the people that are building this stuff and like learn from the source. So you can go check out how they built the schematics for Angular and for Angular material. So with that, thank you very much for coming out. And if you have any questions, I'd love to hear them. Or not. Yeah, absolutely, Ron.
Did you determine if there's a way to reuse some of this template code? For instance, if I wanted to combine different component types into kind of a component that does both things, is there a way to reuse those templates? Or
yeah,
you really just have to copy and paste?
You talk about the templates in the files directory, right?
Yeah.
You need a schematic, which creates.
Yeah.
A schematic, schematics.
You need a schematic to create schematics.
Well, yeah, it's funny. In the beginning, you actually use the schematics. Yeah, I know. I would think that you'd want to probably have separate files. You know what I mean? So that way, you just reduce the complexity of those templates. I mean, it doesn't hurt to have them. You know, I mean, you're not. Yeah, you're kind of repeating yourself, but I would just keep them separated out if I was going to do that. I mean, you can do like the if statements and stuff, and you could really get into some really complex, like where you're, you know, in this case add this, and in that case add that.
I mean, I assume the Angular schematic already has a lot of that component boilerplate.
Yes,
put in there, right?
absolutely. Yeah, a lot of the stuff that you saw there came right out of that Angular CLI repository, and then I just added in like the subject and the things that I wanted. Yeah. So you definitely start there. Like, don't go and reinvent the wheel.
Angular decides, hey, components are all now going to have this thing.
You would then have to go and get a tier. I will say this, and I didn't get a chance to play with it yet, but you can extend the schematic. So you can take the Angular schematic or component, and then extend that.
Right.
I have no idea how it works.
Instead of creates and whatever.
Did you get into extending schematics at all, Kevin, or no?
Executing the schematic.
No, there's a way to extend a schematic, an existing schematic, not run another one. Okay. I'll show you. I found it somewhere, and I was like, that's nice. After I did all of this, right? And I was like, no. But that's part of learning, is just going through the different motions. So. Cool. Good, Matt.
I was going to say, is his name Manfred Stair?
Sounds really familiar.
He has a free schematics book.
Oh, really? Okay.
Oh, you need to know where it's at. Free, something pub.
I think I might have run across that. I'll try to find it, but if you can find it, shoot me a message or put it as a comment on the Rocky Mountain Angular on this meetup, so that way people can check that out. So there's a free resource. Lean Pub. Yeah. Yep. Great. Yeah, go ahead.
So you mentioned that you can, component is going to traverse all the way to the module that you're in.
Yeah.
But could you specify another module that you could
and that actually, I think that function does that as well. So if you pass in the -- or the module option, that you can specify what module to use for a component. Yep. Otherwise, it'll try to find the nearest one. Yep. Yep. And like I said, like, you don't want to write that code. That's why you import those functions out of the schematics utility directory. So when you get started with this stuff, you want to go into like the Angular schematics utility directory, and they've got a whole bunch of files and a whole bunch of functions that you can use. As far as I know, none of this is documented yet. I don't know if that's going to happen one day. Hopefully it does. But you gotta have to like reverse engineer and find out how they did it, and okay, now this is what I do, and I can use this function and import this and kind of use it. So, or use the book that Matt's talking about. Maybe they've got some more documentation around those utility functions. So, yeah, that's kind of the state of it right now. Is still pretty new, I guess. You know, there's not a lot of schematics out there, and that's probably, you know, I don't know if they're still kind of developing schematics or if it's still in flux, but they haven't come out with any sort of like official documentation around it. So. Great. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Okay, so suppose you have not written any, not used a schematic yet. You built your RMA component. You're just building on this component and realizing, oh, I'm going to make this a container component. You could theoretically, I assume, make a schematic that would take your already built component.
Oh yeah. So this is what I didn't want to get into in this talk, which would be like an entire workshop. So TypeScript, so what you end up doing, and I'll try to answer this very briefly, but what you end up doing, and what I had to do to so when you go into the environments file to configure Angular Fire, if you've done Angular Fire, like they give you like a block of like your API key and all this kind of stuff, and you have to copy that into your environments file, right? And I thought, well, this is simple enough. I can do this, right? But that's not a JSON file that you can like parse. It's just a const environments equals an object, right? And so you actually have to get down into like the AST, so the abstract syntax tree of TypeScript. And you can parse a TypeScript file and get the entire AST back. And then using that AST, you can literally like crawl through the tree and find the position where that bracket is, and then find the first import and find the comma, and then add it in at this position and find that. And then you use this thing called a recorder, and then you apply, you like do all your changes in the recorder, and then you commit your changes to that file, which you saw a little bit of it in this presentation. Go check out if you want, go check out the Angular Fire schematic I wrote. I'm not saying it's perfect by any means, but I had to do that. And it's actually, there's still like, it's putting an import. Anyways, it's pretty tricky. And TypeScript underneath the hood, once you get a TypeScript file back, like a TypeScript AST of that TypeScript file, TypeScript it's all typed, obviously, and it has all these constants and enums, and you can find out where an if statement is and if it's an identifier, all these things, and like literally parse the entire TypeScript file. And you have to find out, so if I was going to add that subject in, right, I'd have to add the import and stuff up top. That would be fairly easy to do, right? But then adding the subject as a property, I'm going to alphabetize my properties. I probably need to loop over all the property members in my class, find out where my private one goes, find that location, and then write in at that location this change, right? And then I'd have to say, okay, determine, do I have an on destroy, right? And then if it's not there, then I need to import it in Angular core, and I need to find out where the import, and there's or implements, where the implements keyword is. In TypeScript and AST, you can literally find that's a type, like that implements, and then find where that is and append it to the list, add the function. I mean, it would take hours. Hours. But once it's done, boom, done, So that's kind of the cool thing about, I would say, maybe just to kind of end this, is like, one thing that's really neat about schematics is it's really hard, perhaps, and it takes some time to develop, like that example. But if it's something that you or your team is doing a lot of over and over, hopefully you get that win, back. And hopefully you can also use it to kind of enforce particular architecture and practices in your organization. So cool. Any other questions? That was a good question. Thanks, Steve. Awesome. Thanks, guys. Appreciate you guys coming out. If you have any questions, you can come up and hang out. Otherwise, we've got more beer and pizza, and you're welcome to chill. And yeah, have a great day. Thanks, guys.